Shortly after finishing her meal, Amina felt a sudden and increasingly overpowering need to relieve herself. It was an urgent physical demand that couldn't be ignored any longer. Desperate to find relief, she immediately inquired about the location of the restroom from the nearest server. She was directed accordingly, her hopes rising as she followed the instructions, but upon reaching the door designated for the restroom, she found it was already occupied and in use by another patron, a fresh wave of dismay washing over her. Unable to delay her urgent need any further, Amina frantically looked around and noticed a swinging door that appeared to lead elsewhere within the establishment. Glancing through the small opening before pushing, she couldn't initially comprehend the scene beyond. It seemed blurry and indistinct. Driven by necessity and the desperate urgency of the moment, she pushed resolutely through the door into what she quickly discovered was, in fact, the kitchen area, and the sight that greeted her eyes upon entering was so profoundly shocking and repulsive that it left her instantly feeling nauseous and wanting violently to retch. The entire space was a scene of appallingly unsanitary conditions and profound neglect that struck her with visceral force, making her stomach turn. Piles of grimy, unwashed dishes were stacked precariously high, teetering near the main food preparation area, a breeding ground for unseen contaminants. Raw meat lay uncovered on a counter, a stark and sickening sight, already swarming with dozens of persistent, buzzing flies. The women actively preparing the meals had unwashed, unkempt hair, loosely tied back if at all, and their once white aprons were stiff and covered in countless, embedded stains, looking vividly as though they hadn't seen detergent or water in months. The floor was a squalid, slick mess underfoot, and rats were boldly scurrying and scattering unchecked throughout the entire space, adding to the pervasive sense of filth. Then Amina's eyes fell upon the figure of the head chef, a very large, dark-complexioned woman dressed in a simple, stained, sleeveless dress. Her teeth were visibly discolored, almost brown, and the hair in her armpits was thick, matted, and utterly repulsive. Amina watched in stunned horror as this imposing woman casually used the very cooking spoon she was actively using to stir a large pot of simmering soup to vigorously scratch her visibly unwashed armpit, and then, without a moment's hesitation or any attempt at cleaning or even a cursory wipe, she plunged the very same utensil directly back into the soup pot, stirring it with practiced ease. An immediate wave of overwhelming nausea surged through Amina, threatening to overwhelm her entirely. She felt an intense urge to vomit right there, and then, her stomach convulsing with revulsion. She clutched her stomach reflexively with one hand, while simultaneously clamping the other hand tightly over her nose and mouth, desperate to shield herself from the thick, foul, putrid stench that permeated every corner of the cramped kitchen space. Stumbling backward, she retreated hastily through the swinging door, back to the comparative cleanliness of the dining area, sinking into her seat and feeling a profound sense of shock, betrayal, and overwhelming revulsion. Upon making her hurried exit from the establishment shortly thereafter, she rushed outside, desperate to expel the meal she had just consumed, vomiting on the pavement. Her mind reeled, struggling desperately to comprehend the deeply disturbing spectacle she had just been forced to witness inside what had appeared from the outside to be a respectable eating place. Amina had grown up accustomed to purchasing her meals from various establishments, largely because she lacked both the innate desire and the practical knowledge required to cook at home. She was intimately familiar with countless eateries and local food stalls located throughout the region where she lived, having sampled the fare from virtually all of them at some point. Indeed, it was her ingrained habit to routinely choose a different place to eat each evening, rarely repeating a visit too soon. Her friend, Adwoa, frequently tried to discourage her constant and seemingly unquestioning reliance on purchasing food from outside sources, often remarking with genuine concern, "Aren't you aware it's both significantly more economical and also much safer and healthier for you to acquire groceries from the market and simply prepare your own meals at home? Why do you consistently choose to spend your hard-earned money on buying cooked food from outside instead?" But Amina paid little or no heed to Adwoa's sensible counsel, as she genuinely perceived no issue whatsoever with her habit of dining out every night. She had become completely habituated to eating out, viewing it as the natural way of life, largely because that was precisely the way she was brought up from a very young age. When she was still very young, her parents were almost perpetually consumed by their professional lives and business ventures, allocating virtually no room or time for their children or the essential responsibilities of managing a household. Mr. and Mrs. Osage were blessed with 3 children, Amina, Ya, and Akojua. However, as soon as the children commenced their schooling, their parents effectively ceased providing them with necessary oversight, care, and domestic guidance. Each morning before school, their parents simply provided them with funds to purchase their breakfast and lunch at the school canteen, and upon returning home in the afternoons, they were required to use additional money to buy lunch from a local food stall situated conveniently near their residence. In the evenings, they were simply given money to purchase and consume dinner before their parents eventually returned home from work later at night, often long after the children were settled or asleep. Amina, as the eldest daughter, consequently found herself prematurely stepping into a pseudo-maternal role within the household, despite the difficult fact that she herself was unable to cook, as her mother had never taken the time to teach her this fundamental skill. Their father was a respected professional driver who frequently undertook long-distance journeys, often away from home for 2 or 3 months at a time. He showed little practical concern for domestic matters beyond providing financially for the household, focusing solely on his role as the monetary provider. Their mother was a full-time entrepreneur with a bustling shop situated in the busy Central Market, consistently occupied with her business from early morning until late evening. She departed the house very early each day to avoid traffic congestion and returned only after the children were already asleep. As a result, Amina grew up developing a sense of forced self-sufficiency and learning, by necessity, how to care for herself and her younger siblings during the protracted absences of their parents. She became accustomed to relying entirely on external resources for her basic needs, and all 3 children collectively developed a distinct and ingrained preference for readily available processed snacks and food purchased from vendors, rather than the potentially more nutritious alternative of a home-cooked meal. Tragically, before Amina could even complete her university studies, her father perished in a fatal accident, a devastating blow to the family. Her younger siblings also began accompanying their mother to the market to assist with sales, as her business was thriving and she, aging, required more help in managing it. Subsequent to Amina's successful graduation from university, she was assigned to a distinct and somewhat isolated region of the country to fulfill her 1-year compulsory national service, teaching at a secluded school. Upon her arrival in this new environment, she quickly acclimated and adjusted to her new surroundings with relative ease. It was here that she serendipitously encountered Adwoa. Adwoa, also a recent university graduate, had been assigned to teach at the very same school as Amina for her national service. They quickly formed a close bond, sharing accommodation and living together almost like true sisters, supporting each other in their new roles. In stark contrast to Amina, however, Adwoa seldom purchased food from outside the house. She diligently visited the local market on a regular basis to buy provisions and meticulously prepared her own nourishing meals in their shared home. But Amina, burdened by her upbringing, still lacked the fundamental ability to cook for herself. Once Amina was comfortably settled in her new environment, she immediately began actively exploring her new locale in search of familiar street food vendors and established eateries, specifically seeking out those that offered the most affordable yet palatable meals she could find. Each day was a new culinary experiment as she would sample the fare at a different establishment, seeking out her new favorites. Adwoa observed, with a touch of concern, that Amina hadn't acquired any cooking pots or essential kitchen utensils for their shared home, finding it peculiar that Amina consistently preferred the expense and uncertainty of eating out and seemed to have absolutely no inclination or desire for cooking herself. So, one day, Adwoa gently spoke to Amina, repeating her earlier advice, saying, "Aren't you aware that it's not only significantly more economical but also much safer and healthier for you to buy things at the market and simply cook for yourself at home? Why do you persistently choose to spend your hard-earned money on buying cooked food from outside every single day?" Amina, however, took immediate offense at what she perceived as unwarranted interference and retorted sharply, her voice laced with defensiveness. "Is this expenditure coming out of your own pocket? Have I ever approached you asking for financial assistance? Honestly, how is my personal choice and spending habit any concern of yours? It's my money. I can do what I want with it." Feeling she had inadvertently overstepped a boundary and wanting to preserve their friendship, Adwoa quickly apologized to Amina, explaining that her intentions were purely benevolent and she was simply trying to offer helpful guidance and look out for her friend's well-being. Despite Adwoa's well-intentioned attempts at persuasion and her sincere apology, Amina's deeply ingrained habit of purchasing and consuming food prepared outside the home remained stubbornly unchanged. On one particularly memorable afternoon, as Amina and Adwoa were returning home from their day at work, they were approached by a very attractive and evidently prosperous young man. "Good afternoon." The man greeted them pleasantly, introducing himself as Kwame. He politely requested a moment to speak with Amina privately and, once they had a moment alone, immediately expressed his deep admiration for her, finding her strikingly beautiful and captivating. They exchanged contact details and began communicating frequently by phone, spending hours talking each day. Kwame was a successful entrepreneur with numerous company branches located across the country, indicating his significant wealth and influence. He frequently invited Amina to dine with him at very elegant, often quite costly restaurants, treating her to experiences far removed from her usual street food routine. It wasn't long before Amina found herself developing genuine feelings for Kwame, drawn to his charm and success. However, one significant day, Kwame decided to visit Amina at her residence for the first time. Amina welcomed him warmly into their shared home and offered him a refreshing soft drink as they settled into talk. As they conversed pleasantly, Kwame's stomach let out a noticeable rumble, and he mentioned, perhaps slightly embarrassed, that he was feeling quite hungry. He specifically requested that Amina cook a meal for him right there, expressing a sincere desire to sample her culinary skills and taste what she could prepare. He even graciously offered to accompany her to the market immediately to purchase all the necessary ingredients and food items required for cooking, showing his eagerness. But to his utter surprise and growing confusion, Amina quickly dismissed the idea, telling him it would be a complete waste of precious time and effort to go through the process of cooking a meal from scratch. Instead, she casually suggested, "Why don't we simply call one of those elegant restaurants we frequent and have a delicious meal delivered to us right here? It would be much faster and easier." Kwame, however, firmly refused her suggestion, reiterating his strong desire to taste Amina's own cooking, emphasizing that he wanted a home-cooked meal prepared by her hands. When Amina finally realized that Kwame was absolutely serious and unwavering in his request, she felt a surge of embarrassment and decided she had no choice but to confide the truth in him, confessing sheepishly, "I'm really sorry, Kwame, but I can't cook. I don't know how." Kwame was visibly taken aback by her admission. Amina was such a beautiful, sophisticated, and seemingly accomplished lady, so he found it quite unusual and, frankly, rather disappointing that she completely lacked this fundamental domestic skill. He became very quiet, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by noticeable disappointment, and he shortly thereafter left Amina's house quite abruptly, without much explanation, leaving Amina feeling hurt and confused. When Adwoa returned home later that evening, she found Amina lying on the bed, looking very sad and dejected, clearly upset about something. Adwoa, sensing her friend's distress, immediately became concerned and gently inquired what was bothering her, urging her to share. But Amina, feeling a deep sense of shame and unwilling to admit the real reason for her sadness, the fact that Kwame had left because she couldn't cook, refused to confide in her. Instead, she fabricated a story, claiming she had simply lost some money and that was the sole cause of her sadness and low spirits. She desperately didn't want Adwoa to know the truth and potentially mock her or say, "I told you so," especially considering Adwoa had been consistently cautioning her against relying on buying food outside for such a considerable period, warning her about the potential drawbacks of not knowing how to cook. One particularly notable afternoon, As Amina was returning home from her day at work, she noticed a new, impressive-looking eatery had recently opened directly on her usual route. It was a very recent establishment she had never before had the opportunity to patronize. She walked past it slowly, admiring its attractive and inviting appearance from the street. It seemed to draw numerous patrons, and its exterior design appeared quite luxurious and upscale, giving the impression of a high-quality place. Every time she passed by in the days that followed, it was always bustling with satisfied customers, further piquing her interest. One day, curiosity and the promise of a potentially good and affordable meal finally compelled her to resolve to patronize them herself. She stepped inside the establishment and was immediately delighted by the interior. It looked so clean, beautiful, and remarkably sophisticated for what she assumed would be a moderately priced place. Yet, to her surprise, she found that their food was actually quite affordable, surprisingly so given the ambience and decor. This must be the reason there are always so many customers drawn here, Amina mused to herself as she began to peruse the detailed menu, impressed by the variety and prices. While she was reviewing the various selections available, a server approached her promptly and politely inquired what she would like to order. She placed her order, and the food was brought to her remarkably promptly, efficiently served. The food was indeed delicious, living up to her hopes and expectations, and from that very first day forward, Amina quickly became a dedicated regular customer. She made a conscious point of patronizing them virtually every day, enjoying the taste and convenience, and the servers soon came to recognize Amina and anticipate her daily visits, often greeting her by name. Frequently, when her schedule was particularly demanding or she felt too tired to go out, she would simply call them to have the food conveniently delivered directly to her workplace, a service she found incredibly convenient. However, something profoundly unsettling occurred less than a month after Amina had commenced her regular patronage of this seemingly ideal new eatery. She was at work one afternoon, immersed in her tasks, and had ordered food from the establishment, feeling too exhausted and disinclined to venture out into the heat of the day to get something to eat. When the delivery eventually arrived, she began eating her meal with her usual speed, perhaps mindlessly, while still working. But as she was nearing the very end of the dish, a horrifying sight stopped her mid-chew, causing her to freeze. She discovered a clearly dead cockroach embedded within the food she was consuming. Amina was utterly shocked, bewildered, and immediately nauseated by the repulsive discovery. This was perhaps the first time she had ever actually encountered such a repulsive thing in her food, largely due to her long-standing habit of eating very quickly and often with her hands, without taking the time to properly inspect the contents of her meal before consumption. Amina, naturally, couldn't possibly finish the food and immediately discarded the remainder with a shudder of disgust. Foolishly, however, she didn't take proper caution or report the incident. She simply rationalized it, feeling it must have been an isolated anomaly, a one-off mistake that wouldn't happen again. Only 1 week after this disturbing incident, Amina fell seriously and suddenly ill and required immediate admission to a medical facility. She suffered from severe, debilitating diarrhea and a dangerously high fever that very nearly cost her life, weakening her considerably. Following a thorough examination and diagnosis, the doctor gravely informed her that her severe illness was unequivocally caused by a particularly virulent bacteria known to thrive specifically and exclusively in environments of extreme unsanitary conditions, like a contaminated kitchen. He strongly advised her, his tone serious, always ensure that your kitchen and any food preparation areas are scrupulously clean. You are incredibly fortunate that you were admitted so promptly. This specific ailment is so dangerous and aggressive that it could potentially be fatal within mere days if left untreated. Amina thanked the doctor profusely for saving her life before being discharged from the medical facility, prescribed medication for her recovery, and sent home to recuperate. When she returned home, Adwoa, ever the loyal friend and exhibiting true care, became her dedicated caregiver, nursing her back to health. Whenever Adwoa finished preparing a nutritious meal at home, she would make sure to lovingly offer Amina some of the food to help her regain her strength and nourish her recovering body. But once Amina had made a complete recovery and regained her health, she, unfortunately, didn't truly change her deeply ingrained habits or learn from the terrifying experience. She reverted back to her old ways of purchasing food from outside, seemingly having forgotten the terrifying ordeal she had just survived. To make matters even worse and more baffling, she astonishingly continued to patronize the very same eatery where she had made the repulsive discovery of the dead cockroach and subsequently fallen critically ill. Less than 3 weeks passed before she suffered a relapse and had to visit the medical facility a second time with similar, frightening symptoms, though perhaps less severe. However, when she fell critically ill for the third time in such quick succession, experiencing the same debilitating symptoms, a sense of desperate determination finally took hold, overriding her complacency. Amina decided she would conduct her own covert investigation, determined to understand precisely why she consistently became so sick after eating food from that particular establishment, especially since the eatery looked so outwardly neat, clean, and luxurious from the outside, strongly leading her to believe that the dining area itself, at least, was certainly free from any contaminants. One particular weekend, Amina put her plan into action, feeling a mix of apprehension and resolve. She went to the establishment in the afternoon, as was her habit. She ordered her usual meal, but this time she didn't consume it hastily as was her custom, her mind elsewhere. Instead, she deliberately took her time. Eating slowly and meticulously, carefully observing each portion of rice she scooped with her fork or spoon, carefully examining it to ensure it wasn't contaminated or hide anything disturbing. When she finished eating, she feigned an urgent need to relieve herself once again and asked the server to direct her to the restroom, just as she had done before, hoping for the same outcome. Upon arriving at the restroom, she found it was conveniently already occupied, providing her with the perfect opportunity to implement the next step of her plan and look around the establishment less conspicuously, seeking out the hidden areas. As she ventured deliberately down a nearby hall, feigning confusion, she spotted a familiar-looking swinging door that clearly led to what she strongly suspected was the kitchen area, the same one she had briefly entered weeks ago. Peering cautiously through the door, the sight that greeted her eyes was utterly and sickeningly familiar, yet no less shocking or repulsive the second time around. There was the large accumulation of grimy dishes piled high beside the food preparation area, just as she remembered. There was the raw meat left exposed on the counter, covered in dozens of buzzing, persistent flies. There were the women preparing the meals with unkempt, tied-back hair, their white aprons marked with the same various, embedded stains, looking as though they hadn't been washed in what seemed like months. The entire floor was the same squalid, repulsive mess underfoot, and rats were scurrying freely and boldly throughout the space, completely unchecked, a horrifying testament to the lack of hygiene. Then Amina's eyes fell once again upon the figure of the head chef, the very same large, dark-complexioned woman wearing a simple sleeveless dress, her teeth still noticeably brown and discolored, and the hair on her armpits just as thick and repulsive as she remembered from her first terrifying glimpse. And there it was again. She watched in renewed horror, a wave of nausea rising, as this large woman casually used the very spoon she was actively cooking with to scratch her visibly unwashed armpit, and then, without any hesitation or attempt at cleaning, returned the same utensil directly back into the simmering pot of soup, stirring it as if nothing was wrong. A wave of overwhelming nausea swept over Amina once more, and she felt an intense urge to vomit right then and there, gagging slightly. She quickly retreated backward, pulling the door shut behind her, her heart pounding, and stumbled back to the dining area, sinking into her seat at the table, attempting desperately to appear calm and as though nothing unusual had happened, her face likely pale. Her stomach churned violently with the sickening, horrifying realization that if this outwardly appealing place, which looked so clean from the dining area, could hide such appalling, life-threatening conditions, then many, perhaps most, of the other eateries she had considered clean, reliable, and safe for years might, in fact, operate in precisely the same unhygienic and dangerous manner, hidden away from public view. She reflected with growing dismay and a cold dread on the countless establishments she had visited over the years and the seemingly innumerable meals she had consumed from them, wondering with a shudder if they were all equally, or perhaps even more, unsanitary behind their swinging doors. When Amina finally returned home that evening, shaken and deeply disturbed, she felt a profound sense of shame and profound regret, wishing with all her heart that she had heeded Adwoa's sensible advice much sooner, before enduring the illnesses and discovering the horrifying truth. That day, spurred by the undeniable combination of her terrifying experiences with illness and her newfound, sickening realization about food hygiene, she made a firm and resolute decision that would change her life. She would irrevocably change her habits and begin preparing her own meals from that day forward, taking control of her own health and safety. She immediately set about thoroughly cleaning her entire kitchen area at their shared accommodation, scrubbing it until it gleamed, removing all traces of neglect, and then eagerly turned to the internet, diligently searching for online resources and video tutorials to learn fundamental cooking techniques from scratch. Armed with her newfound determination and a growing sense of purpose, she then made a purposeful trip to the local market to acquire essential cooking utensils she lacked and fresh, wholesome ingredients. When Adwoa returned home that evening, she was utterly astonished and pleasantly surprised to find Amina not only in the kitchen but actively engaged in the process of cooking, a sight she had never expected to see. Changing quickly into her comfortable home clothes, she eagerly joined Amina in the kitchen, offering her assistance and guidance. Together, they finished preparing the meal, working side by side, a new and pleasant experience for both of them. The food, perhaps, didn't look as visually appealing or as sophisticated as the professionally plated dishes she used to buy at the fancy eatery. It was simple and rustic, but as she ate, it tasted truly delicious, and more importantly, she had the absolute assurance and peace of mind that it had been prepared with proper hygiene, fresh ingredients, and immense care by her and her friend. Amina enthusiastically continued to learn and refine her cooking skills, relying heavily on online resources and also receiving patient guidance and instruction from Adwoa, who was delighted to share her knowledge. She completely ceased eating out and frequently began bringing her own thoughtfully prepared home-cooked meals to her workplace, packed neatly in containers. Her colleagues were initially surprised to see Amina consistently bringing her own meals to the office, a stark contrast to her previous habit of ordering in or going out, and would sometimes even join her in eating the delicious and healthy food she prepared, impressed by her transformation. She had successfully found a healthy and fulfilling balance between her former dependency on external food sources and the newfound satisfaction and security of preparing clean, nutritious meals at home. Kwame eventually returned, seeking her out after their abrupt separation, and he sincerely apologized to her for leaving so abruptly after discovering she couldn't cook, acknowledging that he should have been more understanding, and offered support instead of simply departing in disappointment. They discussed the matter openly, resolved their disagreement with newfound maturity, and their relationship flourished, built on honesty and understanding. They were happily married some months later, their future together looking bright. The profound lesson of this story serves as a potent reminder that appearances can be incredibly deceiving. Not everyone or everything, particularly in the realm of food preparation, is as pristine, clean, or trustworthy as it might initially seem from the outside looking in. It is sometimes not just advisable but truly necessary for the sake of one's health to make an effort, where possible, to ascertain the actual conditions under which the food you purchase and consume is being prepared, even if it requires a little extra effort or investigation. Furthermore, regardless of how demanding your professional schedule or personal circumstances might be, always endeavor to dedicate consistent and meaningful time to your children, teaching them essential life skills like cooking and ensuring their well-being and development. And finally, when you genuinely care for someone, you should prioritize their overall well-being and best interests, offering support, understanding, and a willingness to help them learn and grow. Don't abandon someone simply because of a single characteristic or perceived flaw you might initially find undesirable. Instead, attempt to understand the underlying reasons for that characteristic and see if they are willing to learn, grow, or change for the better with your encouragement and support.